Going to demonstrate how to effectively crimp monofilament using aluminum crimps and a hand tool. This hand tool is the Jinkai SC3C. It's a very well made tool, very long handles, aids in leverage. So when you're crimping the larger size crimps, you need as much leverage as possible to get the crimp swaged correctly. The tool is very well made. It has pins and C-clips, so you can take the tool completely apart and oil it, which keeps the tool in perfect operating condition. This is a tool that we use around the shop quite often. I also take it fishing with me. It looks like it's fairly new, yet it's probably around 5 years old. So with a little proper maintenance, they will last you a very long time. And in addition to being a great tool for crimping, this tool actually is very effective in cutting the monofilament. And the cutters on the tool itself will actually cut the mono with very, if any, burr at all, which, as we know, is extremely important when we're trying to slide the aluminum crimp over the top. So the monofilament size that we're going to be crimping today is 200 pound test, and we could be sure we can measure it using our dial indicator or our vernier and checking it. And once again, here we are, we're at 1.4 millimeter. I know it's upside down, but it's a 1.4 millimeter diameter monofilament. We could use several different sources to check the size. We're going to assume that 1.4 millimeter is 200 pound test Moi Moi high catch, which it is, and that is a G crimp. Take an aluminum G crimp, and we're going to slide it over the monofilament. And once again, we'll use some hydraulic tubing. This is a hydraulic chafe tubing. It comes in longer lengths, such as so. And you can cut it down to 1.25 inches, 1 inch, 1 3/4. Allows you to make a very large loop or a very small loop, depending upon what your application is or what your personal preference is. Generally speaking, we like to cut these around 1.25 inches or so. And once we measure it up at 1.25 inches, we'll just take our anvil cutters and we'll cut the appropriate amount of tubing off. So now once we are set to make our loop, we already have put the crimp over the monofilament. We'll take the chafe tubing and we are going to slide that over the end of the monofilament. Insert it back into the sleeve and push the tag end out. At this point, it's optional. We sometimes do, we sometimes don't. We're going to burnish the end using our butane or cigarette lighter. Heat it up. Form the burr nicely, nice round ball. And then we're just going to slide that burr, that burnish, right hard up against the crimp. And that's not going to let the monofilament slide out of that one end of the crimp, if you will. Take our chafe gear, slide it back down on the tag end side, and once it's there, you'll notice that since the burnish has been done, the burr has been made, we can't get the mono out. Once the chafe gear is up against the crimp, all we need to do then is pull the main line of the monofilament, and it forms a perfectly sized loop for the amount of distance we've created by cutting the chafe gear at 1.25 inches. Now the important part, the chafe part, the crimp part, excuse me. Take your hand tool, has 3 different size holes on the jaws. The G crimp is the largest size. The Jinkai tools all come with a guideline piece of paper, sometimes it's printed on the package, of what crimps go into what size cavity on the tool. The G crimp and the F crimp both go in the largest cavity on the back end of the tool. And what I like to do is the following. We put the tool in, make sure that the crimp is in the tool completely symmetrical. We don't want the crimp too much this way, too much that way. We want the crimp directly center in the cavity. We also have to have a little bit of the crimp overhanging, and that's going to give us a nice flare end on the crimp. Also, we want to take note on the orientation of how we're going to crimp this crimp. So in this instance, I have the tag end or the burnished end facing up towards me. Once it's in there nice and square and symmetrical, all I'm going to do is squeeze. And I generally just squeeze until I can't squeeze the crimp tool anymore. We take it out, inspect it, and we have found that we have made a beautiful first swedge on the aluminum crimp. And what I mean by that is we have a nice even parting line on both sides of the crimp. So it was completely centered in the crimp tool. We also have a nice flare right here, and that's very important. What that does is it flares the aluminum crimp away from the mono. If there's any sharp edges on the aluminum crimp, it will not touch the mono and cut the mono off. More importantly, that flaring action actually pushes down on the chafe tubing, which makes the chafe tubing become stressed up against the mono. And that's very important. As you have a fish on, the mono is going to stretch. If the loop, or the chafe gear in the loop I should say, is not tight up against the crimp, it will actually move within the crimp. If that occurs, your hook or your swivel can get in between the crimp and the mono and actually cut the monofilament rather quickly. So we want to avoid that, and the easiest way to do it is to, like I said, pull back on the mono, crimp it, and make sure your flare is very well formed like that. And we always crimp the chafe gear side or the hook side or the swivel side first to hold this all in position. Now we're going to make the second swedge, the second crimp on the connector. And once again, we're going to have it so that the berm or the burnish or the tag end bubble is facing in the upright position, since we crimped it that way the first time as well. Take our tool one more time. Insert the crimp into the tool, make sure it's centered. Once again, we have a significant amount of the crimp overhanging out of the tool, and we're just going to squeeze again until we can no longer squeeze anymore. Now we've made the second swedge on the crimp, and it's looking really nice. I've swedged it so that there's the same amount of distance on both ends. The bubble in the center, where I have not crimped it yet, is perfectly formed. And we've been crimping all along on the same plane. So in other words, we've had the tag end facing up. Well, we're going to make the final crimp, and when we make the final crimp, we're going to rotate the crimp 180 degrees. So the tag end is now facing on the bottom. And that's a little detail that is kind of important. Should you choose not to do that, the opportunity of the crimp bending can actually occur. And this is what I did earlier, and I swedged it all in the same direction. And if you notice, you'll see that the way I'm holding the crimp right now, the crimp actually bends down. And it's bent in that direction. Chances are it did not affect the holding power of the mono within the crimp, but it's not perfect. We can make it perfect by just doing a very simple procedure. So instead of having the tag end or the burnished end of the mono facing up, I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees. The tag end or the burnished end will be now facing down. We take our hand tool, insert it back in. We center it on the bubble that is left on the crimp. Once it's nice and center, once again we just squeeze until we can no longer squeeze any longer. Remove the crimp from the tool, and you have a perfectly formed Moi Moi G crimp on 200-pound Moi Moi high catch monofilament. Equal distance between all the crimps. The parting lines are identical, so the crimp itself was put in the tool correctly and equally. And this is a 100% connection.